year ago, I'm sure many of the people in this room had not heard of an initial coin offering, had not heard of a cryptocurrency exchange, had not heard of a crypto investment fund. And now we have Paris Hilton marketing these products. We have Mayweather, the boxer, marketing these products. We have just an astronomical amount of funding going into this area. Maybe you can give us a sense of background. What's going on in this space, and why has there been this flurry of activity, particularly within the last year and perhaps even within the past 6 months, Frank?
I can let Manny speak first because I've already spoken a lot.
Well, I think the main drivers, of course, is there's money in all of this. And people who've used traditional methods, and I know it sounds with all the hands that went up, there's a lot of traditional bankers and I think some regulators present here as well. All the hoops you have to go through to register, to set up a fund, to be a security, to be compliant and so on and so forth, have created lots of obstacles in a number of places in the world. So money, like we heard about Bitcoin earlier on, finds a way, trust me, to try and do things differently. I've just come from the CrowdInvest Summit in LA, and I'm speaking at the World Funding Summit in 2 weeks' time back in LA again. And I had Brock Pierce on one of the panels that I set up there. He started the first fund, Blockchain Capital, invested in 38 initiatives in this space. And he gave figures of, we're approaching 3 billion. Now, 12 months ago, the number was 0. That was raised through ICOs and ITOs and TGEs, whatever it's called today. And the projection is between 20 and 30 billion by next year. So when I read about a bubble in the press, this ain't a bubble yet. It's just starting. The interest and the appetite for money to become more liquid, we heard that term earlier on, for capital that has been invested in gold and silver and mining operations. I have some clients who want to turn mining operations into ICOs. It's possible, trust me, it can be done. Is spurring a whole new way of looking at money, of managing money, of creating liquidity, which of course is confusing the hell out of our more traditional folks with traditional approaches and mechanisms of managing and regulating and licensing the management of money. So I think the challenge has just started. And I always like to say Canada is the center of the universe, because from here you can go anywhere in the world. Our challenge is, if our young startups and entrepreneurs don't get satisfaction here, they simply go elsewhere. So we're going to talk about that later on, but the game is on. Big institutional investors are stepping into this game, and I'll quickly give you an example. I have a client down in California, one of 7 states that treat Bitcoin as a commodity. Together, there are over 70 IRAs in the United States, sitting on over $1 trillion. They want to put 200 million into Bitcoin. And they've asked me to set up a fund, just to give you an idea of how fast and how quickly in a regulated environment. Because remember, like a precious metal, a Bitcoin is treated in 7 states in the United States as a commodity. So the regulation is already in place, the whole way in which they manage custodian accounts, the whole way your Bitcoin is stored on a hard wallet, similar to vaulting gold and silver. They got it, and they're good to go. And there's already 7 funds up and running, with 70 more wanting to get involved. So there's money coming into the space. There's highly liquid, doesn't care about risk money, already 200 billion worth sitting in cryptocurrencies, looking for a place to go. So again, how we manage this, and yes, the Paris Hiltons and the Mayweathers of the world have become poster childs, if you wish, or cheerleaders for a whole new way of raising capital and investing it. What happens with it is another matter. I'll quickly chuck in a prediction here, then I'll stop speaking. But I think 90% of all startups, as we all know, has been in the startup phase space, will fail. And I predict the same will happen with ICOs as well. They simply won't take off, or they'll disappear. So yes, be careful. I've seen some insanely great ideas on the blockchain and with cryptocurrencies. I've also seen insanely stupid ideas and things are actually out there having raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and I don't know what they're going to do with the money. They literally themselves don't know what to do with the money. They call me. It's a bit of a crazy Wild West space, but the game is on.
Well, I like that the game is on notion, and I would agree. There's I think what we're seeing is we've seen the first wave. I think the stat I heard was $2 billion raised up to the end of sort of October. So $3 billion doesn't surprise me, and frankly, the numbers don't surprise me. And I don't disagree with you on the fact that this is risk capital, and it's the next generation of where risk capital is getting invested. I think, though, that what we've seen over the last few months is the first material reaction from regulatory authorities, both in Canada and elsewhere, with respect to ICOs. And I think we've had a chance to digest some of that. The previous panel talked about regulatory lack of regulatory clarity being a real material issue. I think that's true, but people are, because there's such enthusiasm, because there's so many opportunities here, I think people are they're trying to address it, and they're finding ways to address it. So the areas that we're seeing where regulatory authorities are looking at now are obviously ICOs as being, whether they constitute securities or not, whether the capital raising activities that they've undertaken are or have been done in accordance with applicable securities laws from a registration standpoint. And we're seeing some attempts at regulatory arbitrage in between different jurisdictions. But frankly, more and more jurisdictions are sort of speaking up and saying, wait a second here. New Zealand yesterday, I think, came out and said, we think it's a security. So in most cases, that's not surprising. It's sort of consistent with a lot of other major jurisdictions. So I think what we are doing is we're digesting those initial reactions from regulatory authorities, and we're helping companies address that and adjust their expectations and adjust their plans to still take advantage of this great opportunity, but in a manner that doesn't offend the regulatory authority regulations that are in place today. Now, I think the other side of the coin, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves in questions, is how do you influence the regulatory authorities and governments to adjust the mechanisms that are in place to take advantage of these innovations in a manner that is not going to put people at risk.
Right. Did you want to say something else? Maybe?
Yeah, just there's a bit of a story thread I want to pull here. Too many ICOs approached me, and I'm one of those who also get 10 calls a day. Say, well, we have great advisors on our team, and yes, we're going to figure out how this token is going to get done. And I asked them, have you spoken to a lawyer? And they say no. Now that's already a sign that these guys are just winging it. They just want to get out there and catch this wave. You need to get your lawyers involved. Lawyers talk to regulators. Lawyers don't set people up for failure. They set them up for success. It's a great time to be a lawyer in this space, by the way.
We didn't pay him to say that, by the way. Maybe a big one.
Because the next challenge is going to be, and thanks to Gowling, we hosted MME Thomas Linder in Vancouver 2 weeks ago, full house. These are the guys who actually helped Ethereum set up in Zug in Switzerland, which is now called Crypto Valley. And he started illustrating there where their thinking is already at with this whole token thing. And I have two very important points to make on this. We need to be very, very careful when we start treating token-generated events as a security. You just heard me say earlier on, 90% of these things are going to fail. If you start declaring things securities and they fail, it's going to be a mess. So we must be careful to suddenly label every token, whatever it is, as a security. So we need to be careful there, because the next wave of token generating events is not going to be the infrastructure, as you heard on the previous panel. Blockchain, platforms and Bitcoin and so forth. It's going to be apps. DApps, as we call it, distributed or these decentralized applications like wallets and so forth. That's the big wave that's coming. 90% of those tokens are not securities at all. So we also need to educate ourselves and get into the game from a regulatory perspective, from a legal perspective, but also the people who put their business models together. That we need to become clear about the language, about what this token is going to do and what are we going to do with other people's money that are obviously prepared to go at risk putting it into your venture. So there's a whole state of play, and I think these will be many events that if you're going to engage in this game, that you're going to need to attend and not just do Reddit. Please, Reddit, it can get scary. A lot of spam, a lot of misinformation. You need to just become informed, and I think events like this is obviously going to help the process.
Okay, well, let's do perhaps a deeper dive into initial coin offerings. So, Manny, somebody wants to do one of these ICOs, ITOs, token sales, token generating events, whatever you want to call them. What is your role in that process, and what are some factors that you ask those parties to consider?
Well, again, we look at the role models, and I'll keep mentioning Switzerland because I think they are ahead of the game. They have a more liberal environment than we do, but having said that, there's no reason why we can't do a lot of what they're doing there. They have a very stable financial system with good regulations and a way to do remedy if things go wrong. I don't think Canada should be afraid to experiment a little bit as well. In fact, that's the words used by some of our ministers of finance. We're organizing a webinar as the Blockchain Association of Canada with all the ministers of Canada, finance and their representatives by the end of this month to talk about blockchain, to talk about token generating events, to talk about how we can keep pushing innovation and investment into this space going forward so we don't lose the next Ethereums to Switzerland. But also grow the skills, talent pool, and again the regulatory know-how and go-to support these ventures. So in terms of where we're going to go with ICOs, again a statistic, the World Funding Summit people did a research there. Just one aggregator of ICOs has got 600 ICOs on their books in the pipeline, 150 already processed. I'm tracking 20 more aggregators of ICOs in production around the world. So if you just think about that and the scale of this thing, one can start thinking to what degree can Canada capture that market, not push away that market, but capture it in a way that's still compliant and we don't create more risk inside the system. The other note around advisors, the Mayweathers and the Hiltons of the world, is the role of an advisor on any of these ICOs has changed. It's not just being a poster child or cheerleader for somebody's event. My background is legal, and I used to be corporate secretary on many publicly listed companies from here to India to South Africa and elsewhere. And the role increasingly of an advisor is to really become a custodian for what are usually youngsters with respect, trying stuff, using other people's money. And one is there and involved and responsible, partially, for getting it done right, for making it compliant, for making sure that what was the original vision doesn't end up spent on a yacht in the Caribbean, which does happen, trust me. Sorry, hand up.
Of the hundreds of ICOs that you've seen, how many of those are currencies and how many of those are tokenized representational assets?
I think the more mature ICOs are really digging into the whole what we call a utility or an app token. The Ethereum's was what we would call a platform or a protocol token, which probably would have, if we did it in Canada, would have been deemed a security. So the challenge was, do we stay here or go to Switzerland, where they said, let's give this a go. So that has to play out from a protocol or a infrastructure token thing, which puts you in the security camp. And the new tokens that's coming, which is really, it's like if you have a air miles, for instance, is a good example. Your air miles are partially a reward, partially a loyalty scheme, partially retaining you as a customer type of token that's in play. That's a completely different animal. And we're going to see a raft of those coming from financial institutions, from retail sector. Alibaba is a leading example in the space. I'm consulting to a competitor to Alibaba in China as we speak. I'm off to Shanghai next week. Who want to enter the North American market and tokenize their offering for wealth management to millennials, to give you an example. That token I would not deem a security. But we're going to test it with the regulator and obviously work through good legal advisors. That's the new play. And 90% of the future token issues, I believe, will fall in that.
Thank you.
So, Ian, why don't you talk a little bit about the role of counsel on these initial coin offerings? What have lawyers, including Gowling's, been doing in terms of an ICO when we're approached?
So I think that I mentioned before that the first wave of ICOs, I don't, and I think Manny's right, at least anecdotally, a lot of stuff didn't happen with a lot of legal advice in it. And if you look at white papers of some of the early ICOs, I'm sure they're technically adept, but from the standpoint of somebody who reviews offering memoranda and other securities-related documents, it's risk factors and other sort of considerations we would expect to see in those kinds of documents are completely absent. So as far as the role of the lawyer involved in getting an ICO completed, I think there's a few things that happen. The first one is really the gating item is it a security or not? And at least in Canada, we've got some guidance from the CSA around that and the distinction between whether it's a utility token and potentially not a security, or whether it falls into the camp of a security. And CSA has come forward and said, we think most of these are securities. And I think, but again, we've got to remember that this stuff is evolving very quickly, and Manny makes a good point about the nature of things that are happening. So that's certainly one of the first things that we get involved in, and we dive deep on this. The notion of what is a security and what is not a security has been discussed in court decisions over generations. So it's not like this is the case. Some of the case law we've had to pull out is rather old, and as a sort of legal historian, it's interesting to go through that kind of stuff and then apply it in present tense. So that's sort of step one. And then depending if it is a security, then we have to deal with the circumstances that arise. So if you want to do a token generating event or an ICO and you're pretty confident it's going to be a security, then you've got to think about it in the context of what exemptions are available under applicable securities laws to issue those securities to the people that are acquiring them, and what protections do you need to put in place and what compliance requirements do you need to establish, and address some of the points that Manny had said. And so, from our perspective, that's the process to get to that stage, where you get into where it's not clear cut, or your business model is not accommodated by current regulation. Then we're into potentially looking at engaging with at the OSC level the Launchpad, which has been established as a sort of a sandbox or a test place for adjusting these kinds of opportunities, and people sort of complain about the fact that they don't move fast enough, but there is eagerness to make sure that Canada plays a role in this space. So I think they've actually been quite, as regulators go, they've been quite responsive. And so one of the, we would encourage people to reach out to the Launchpad or go with them into to Launchpad, or engage with the other securities regulatory authorities across Canada, and we've had some success with that. And Guzman mentioned some examples up front. The AMF has released some decisions with regards to, and sort of the OSC actually, with regards to impact, and we've seen recent decisions with regards to the OSC in respective token funder, which is which I guess is yesterday, has started its ICO, I think, as of November 1st. So we'll see if these are successful, and I think that we're going to test the waters. But that's the process that we play in the ICOs, and obviously more traditional role of documenting these types of transactions as well, and supporting both the investors and the companies and the entrepreneurs.
Yeah, Ian, if I could just stay on you for a second. So we've seen a lot of parties come to us where Mind and Management is based here in Ontario or some other Canadian jurisdiction, and then they say, well, I'd like to base my operation or my ICO raise from some foreign jurisdiction like Switzerland or Singapore or Isle of Man or Gibraltar or where have you. Are there potential securities laws issues with that?
Yeah, I think that I think people have to remember that the way Ontario securities laws and generally speaking Canadian securities laws are defined, a trade in I don't want to get too into the weeds on securities law, but a trade is defined broadly to include acts in furtherance of a trade, and there have been circumstances in the past where the securities regulatory authorities have gone after organizations who have placed securities overseas, but they flowed back into Canada relatively quickly. And so people need to, if they want to play the regulatory arbitrage game and set up a facility in one of the jurisdictions that Usman has said, but still maintain their operations here, and there's some concerns or someone or a significant and the securities flow back or whatever circumstance arises. I don't think the OSC has said that they will not turn a blind eye on those things. So people need to keep that in mind. That's not, in my view, it's not a silver bullet just to say we're going to set up in Gibraltar or we're going to set up in Barbados. It's not that simple.
Yeah, it's not only the OSC that has said that, but also other Canadian jurisdictions that have
Yes.
told us that as well. So let's stay on the issue of jurisdiction. Manny, you've traveled to many jurisdictions. You mentioned Switzerland, where the MME folks are based. You've been to Germany. You've been to many other countries. A lot of parties talk to you about the question of jurisdiction and where they should base their capital markets activity. So what are your thoughts on that? What are some trending topics there?
Well, for those who are considering an ICO here, let me quickly run through all the jurisdictions that stepped up into this game. Isle of Man, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the UK, London partially, certainly the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Malta, Gibraltar, Singapore. People are leaving Hong Kong for Singapore because of the Chinese situation. You now need to become, they're going to stop the banning of ICOs. You're going to have to become licensed. So that announcement is coming, which will restart the process there. And then we have our hubs, and I think your typical fintech hubs are going to step into the space as well. Having said that, what people need to consider who are busy, either have been involved in or are planning an ICO, is nothing sinister if people don't do it in Canada. The main reason why people actually go to these other jurisdictions is for tax reasons. If your fund, if you've raised 100 million and you immediately have to pay 24 or 40% tax in the United States or Canada, that's a bit of a no-no when you haven't even spent the money yet. So that's a consideration for a startup or an entrepreneur. Also in Switzerland, if your coins become tradable, which will become an issue for ICOs as well, it attracts GST. I think the thing that gets the OSC and other SEC and others backs up is similar to a Bitcoin. People call their tokens initial coin offerings. The moment you create a coin and it becomes tradable and it gains in value and it's on an exchange, of course, a security-minded regulator is going to look at this. So I think people must also stop using that formula. That was the initial formula. If you're just an air mile or a token or a reward or a loyalty program, why the heck do you need to put it on an exchange? I think it's people double dipping in the ICO space, quite frankly. They raised money and now they want to make more money. To do what with? As a business person, as a company secretary, I would query that. So I think there needs to be some maturity, and I think the regulator and legal counsel is forcing people to really think more carefully about their approach, about their jurisdiction. Plus, a lot of Canadians, because of my chairmanship role of the Blockchain Association, said, if I go to Cayman Islands, am I okay? I said, listen, are you still a Canadian? Yes, you're going to be paying tax back at home. Don't forget that. So it's not like you're off the hook. It's not a free-range chicken situation. Things do come home. So where you declare, how you declare it, how you set up your business, do you use a foundation, which you probably all heard about Tezos, people I know, dispute between the founders and the people who manage the foundation in Switzerland is coming back to bite them because there's a disagreement about how the money gets spent. And again, it has regulatory and legal implications. So think this process through. Use your legal counsel properly. It's not just about raising capital, it's about managing other people's money.
Did you want to add anything to that? I think that's a really good point. I think that people shouldn't get too caught up in the very early stages of just getting the capital. You got to think about the governance of it over time. One of the criticisms I think that apply to ICOs as compared to capital raising in corporations or limited partnerships or other vehicles that people are more familiar with is there's a governance component to them that's available to investors. It hasn't been the case with ICOs. It's going to be about there's going to be a maturing process around that. But I think my guess is the ones that are going to be successful are the ones that have the good business models and have strong governance models and have a view as to how the capital can get utilized effectively, not just in the first sort of couple of quarters, but over the course of time.
Yeah. So I think if you're an ICO here in North America, what I'm hearing the SEC and the OSC doing is steering ICOs towards the crowdfunding model, where you need accredited investors or very solid KYC, high net worth individual, whoever gets involved. So in other words, to get the risk capital out of the system, which could be tainted anyway. So my prediction is, and has been all along, is that we'll probably end up in an ICO similar to crowdfunding type environment with those types of rules and checks and balances and governance that will be imposed on the ICO Canada version. My sense.
Yeah, so just staying on the ICO front and very briefly, but just to update you on the litigation side. So yesterday the SEC issued a warning involving ICO endorsements by celebrities, saying that many of these are potentially illegal. They cited, among other things, the anti-touting provisions of federal securities laws, and that these individuals could be acting as unregistered brokers, participating in unlawful offering. We saw just yesterday evening a criminal prosecution commenced by the U.S. Attorney in New York against Recoin and others. That follows on a SEC prosecution against these individuals for making misleading statements and potentially engaging in a fraud involving an ICO. Among other things, they said that they had raised funds when they hadn't. They said that they had professional advisors, but they didn't. And we've seen also activity here in Canada on that front as well. So there's a prosecution currently going on by the AMF, the Autorité des Marchés Financiers, which is our Quebec securities regulator, against Plexcoin for making various alleged misleading statements. They moved to have interim cease trade orders and freeze orders put in place. There's now just recently been a decision rendered by the Superior Court in Quebec finding those individuals in contempt of those orders. And so there's a sentencing or a penalty decision that is going to be made next month. On the blockchain front, we've been seeing a lot of other activity, particularly from the SEC and the CFTC, including from issuers who are taking in Bitcoin and failing to properly update their public disclosure, noting that the acceptance of Bitcoin can and the fluctuations in that particular currency can actually impact the business operations of the issuer as well. So separate and apart from ICOs, we at this firm have been monitoring many other developments in the capital market space, whether it's crypto investment funds or others. But separate and apart from all the capital raising efforts that are out there, there are many, many other initiatives being pursued by other parties in the capital market space. Securities trading, we talked about disruption in different areas. Securities trading is an area that is being directly looked at by exchanges. So NASDAQ came out a little while ago with their platform called Link, which recorded the first private securities transaction through a blockchain platform. That transaction settled in less than 10 minutes. There was no paperwork involved, an immutable record. The TMX just a few weeks ago indicated that they formed a partnership with the Central Bank and Payments Canada to address the securities settlement and clearing process. A few months prior to that, they actually announced that they had created a prototype for the natural gas exchange to have that leading energy exchange put on a blockchain platform as well. Separate and apart from securities trading, the area of corporate voting is looking to be disrupted as well. And so NASDAQ has formed an arrangement with the government of Estonia, and particularly the Tallinn exchange, to allow for corporate voting to be executed through a blockchain platform to ensure that shareholder democracy truly occurs and that votes are being tallied, as opposed to dealing with our somewhat archaic proxy voting infrastructure system. And the same thing is being done by the TMX. They announced in April that they have developed an electronic shareholder voting system prototype, which is based on a DLT, or distributed ledger technology platform. So there's a lot of developments in this space, whether it's ICO related, whether it's investment fund related, and other areas. Let's just take a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind. So, Don, go ahead.
Aren't you terrified about the possibility of kind of a recrudescence of shareholder populism that could lead to the same kind of evils in corporations as we now see with whole countries? You
Because
know what I mean?
of
Too much democracy.
too much democracy.
Yeah, I'm serious.
Manny, is too much democracy a bad thing?
Well, again, it's back to governance. I think we have the same debate in digital identity. Once your personal detail, you can even put your DNA sequence on the blockchain. It's possible. Who holds that information, who tracks that information, who at the end of the day, apart from yourself, owns and is a custodian of that information.
Everybody is.
And the problem with democracy is the same. If everyone can see everything that everybody else is doing, to what degree is that a risk as much as a good at the same time? So these debates are very alive and well. And again, where we draw a line or not is interesting.
Yeah, you know what? I'm more terrified than Anthony or the other gentlemen who were on this panel earlier, but I'm not
more terrified than you.
Well, I imagine you are, but when I get terrified, it's like I got to learn some stuff, and get involved. I'm reminded of there's a woman named Blythe Masters who was a big shot trader for a long time and founder of Digital Asset Holdings, and her sort of big aha point was, look, we've had lightning fast trading on the front end of systems in the capital markets for a long time, but on the back end, there's increasing cost and revenues in the investment banks have gone down, and so we've got all these layers of regulation and compliance, in part because this need for trust and verification, and so maybe too much. Maybe there's such a thing as too much democracy. I'd like to see it first and then sort of reflect upon it. But if these kinds of systems, if blockchain systems are going to allow us to take out layers of unnecessary administration and cost and have more liquidity in the marketplace, I don't see that as being a bad thing.
At the very least, what the blockchain technology allows us to do is to start automating processes. But at the same time, it creates unbelievable transparency and immutability and time stamping and recordal and so forth. And I'll give a quick example. Friends of mine run a company called Blockchain Intelligence Group out of Vancouver. They are hired by RCMP to trace illegal transactions using Bitcoin and other stuff effectively. So if you use that example and translate it to everything's going to be on a blockchain, it means you can start tracking and tracing everything. And what is our interest from a government side in all of this? You want to make sure you pay your taxes, you report your income, the usual stuff. But it's going to become automated. It's going to become more direct peer-to-peer, as we call it in the decentralized world. Bitcoin. Somebody made a statement recently on a panel. Bitcoin is on track to become the largest bank in the world. And at first I thought, what do you mean? And I thought about it. Yes, looking at the volume and the way Bitcoin works, transacting between people, exchanging money, is what banks should have been doing from the beginning, without a middleman, without the layers and the costs and the delays and so forth that we've become used to. There's a whole new paradigm emerging here, to use that paradigm word. New ways of dealing with privacy and information and transparency and governance. We need to think about this.
Great. I see another question. Yep.
Thank you so much. Two uniqueness on the panels. The panels have focused on the security side. Can we get some color and update on the role of the initiatives by the Canadian chartered banks and the Canadian payment system, their views, and what initiatives are they taking in the
Sure. So I'm a securities lawyer. I'll admit that I'm not as up to speed on some of this stuff as others. I'd like to have other panelists in here, but we sort of, and other people on our team. So certainly we've been engaged with those folks. I don't know if you want to speak to someone else on our team.
Yeah, on the payment side, we have a whole crypto team with other professionals involved on that, and have that focus. But JP Morgan Chase, for example, just came out with a quite extensive blockchain interbank payment system. Despite Jamie Dimon's remarks about whether Bitcoin is a fraud or not, in fact, his institution has been working on a quite cutting-edge platform. A few of us, one of my partners, Parna, and I, attended the very same day that RBC launched their shadow ledger on the payment side. So that's a private blockchain solution to RBC's cross-border branching. It's a payment system as between their branches. So what they've done is basically created, as I understand it, a mirror or shadow ledger to track those same payments, to test it out and see how it will work. We understand from RBC that in 2018, they plan to launch a loyalty-based program on a blockchain platform as well, and that will go live in 2018. And I had talked about various bank-led initiatives on the blockchain side, particularly with respect to payments, but then let's talk about blockchain enterprises that are looking to disrupt what the banks are doing. So you have groups like Ripple, which is looking to disrupt the international remittance payment system. You have groups that are Canadian grown, like Paycase, looking to do exactly the same thing. So we talked about many different industries. Payments is definitely an area that many of us have been watching with great interest in terms of the blockchain applications that we've been seeing.
I think from a regulatory standpoint, the other areas to note, so derivative trading would be a relevant consideration, whether you fall into the regulatory ambit of that. If you're dealing with consumers, what consumer protection considerations are relevant both on a federal level in Canada and also on a provincial level. Those would play a role, and then there's you got to think about there's a regulatory analysis across sectors depending on what you're intending to disrupt, and you can play the Uber game of go first and try and catch up on the regulation or try and influence changes, or you can think about it more carefully in advance. I would obviously advocate think about it carefully in advance, but those are there.
So I advise quite a few financial institutions in Canada, and specifically credit unions, and they're tiptoeing around this. And to confuse matters completely, blockchains come in different flavors. Ripple, by the way, is not a blockchain. It's just an IOU tokenized exchange, if you wish. It's a SWIFT, another version. Banks are steering away from tokens altogether, using platforms such as Hyperledger, and the latest research shows 1 in 4 financial institutions use your public blockchains like Ethereum. The other 4 use Hyperledger or private blockchains, which has no tokens in it. You can attach a token, you can attach a smart contract, But I think the banks are looking at how do we get rid of this token issue, which could create other dimensions, and let's just get the whole private side sorted. Sorry, it's my phone buzzing. So again, this is all still evolving as we speak, and I think the banks are going to follow the safe and secure and what we can measure, methodologies are in place and so forth throughout, which will take time. And that's pretty much the outcome that we had from the Bank of Canada experiment with distributed ledger technology, and I think Payments Canada was involved.
Yeah.
And the conclusion of their report was inconclusive. We still need to wait and see. Our finance minister here in Ontario refers to blockchain as still the experiment. So I think that's very much the mode of your regulator and your financial institution. So this still needs to play out. I think, as Anthony said, and Anthony was one of the people who got me involved day one. It's still early days. It's still a lot of experimentation going on. What form, shape, and flavor of token, not to mention blockchain platform, will emerge eventually, if not many, we still need to wait and see.
Right, and the Bank of Canada project that you're referring to is a Jasper project.
That's yes.
Right. I saw another question here. Maybe that'll be our last one, but go ahead.
Well, just related to the bank issues and interbank payments and Jasper.
Right.
The core technologies assessed during that was R3, Corda, DLT. So I'm wondering what your views on that is. It's interesting that we had a conversation about banks and Canadian banks, which are members of the R3 consortium. I was wondering, in particular, Manny, your view of that, which isn't a pure blockchain play either. There's a centralized dormant function. I was wondering your opinion of R3.
Well, R3 increasingly, I can't speak for them, obviously, but Corda, as you probably now know, is in a partnership with Hyperledger. So you can now use Corda on Hyperledger, because I think they found that some components were missing in terms of functionality and so forth, I presume. So R3, I think, has been a tremendous initiative around getting people around a table, and that's the feedback I have had from Tim Swanson, who used to be the head of strategy there. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of open-minded thinking about where's this all going without final conclusions being drawn. And I think it's still a wait and see in that regard. But I know Corda is now working with Hyperledger. That much I'm aware of. And I think they've been talking to the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance as well.
Okay, well, I want to thank this panel. Manny, you're terrific as always. As a token of appreciation, we've seen Anthony's style, and we know that you have style as well, but do you have Gowling socks?